Hello and welcome to this episode of Rocks with Russ. In this episode we're going to look at sedimentary rocks and tease out some of the grammar we can get out of the language of rocks here. Each of these rocks has a story to tell, like with igneous rocks and with metamorphic rocks. Each of those has a story to tell. Each of us can tell something about the environment where they were formed. And that tells us something about the history of that rock. Or I should say, that's the rock telling us something about its history. And again, our goal overall is to be able to learn to speak that language. And of course, this takes a lot of study and just a lot of fun field work and a lot of just thinking through and observing. So let's get at it. Sedimentary rocks are perhaps, arguably, some of the most exciting rocks you're going to run into. They tell the story of the current land surface really well, although going back billions of years. One of my favorite really old sedimentary rocks are banded iron formations, because these tell us something about the history of the evolution of photosynthesis and the production of oxygen in our atmosphere and in our oceans over a billion years ago, where we know life was doing stuff, right, and evolving. And so that's recorded in this particular rock. And there are other examples of that, but this is a really awesome piece of that. So sedimentary rocks also preserve life in the form of fossils that are much more visible. This is a slab of limestone from the Cincinnati, northern Kentucky area, and you can see an array of really cool fossils here that are really important and useful for paleontologists to study, to understand what the ecosystem was like 450 million years ago in that area during the Ordovician period. That's a long time ago, and none of us were around to experience it, yet we have this sedimentary record which tells us a lot about that time period. So this particular slab is a wealth of information, has a lot to say to us about when it was deposited in a carbonate environment. Tropical carbonate. Can you imagine a tropical carbonate, a shallow marine situation in Cincinnati, Ohio? It's mind-boggling, right? So, but that same thing was going on where I live here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia around the same time, where we had limestones forming, and this is a limestone from that time. Limestones are chemical sedimentary rocks. So there's two big categories of sedimentary rocks: chemical and clastic, and chemical and clastic. And so clastic are formed from fragments that are cemented together. Chemical are formed in a variety of ways. So there's evaporites, where a sedimentary rock will be a chunk of, in this case, rock salt or halite, and a variety of other salts that crystallize out. Calcium carbonate being one of those salts during evaporation. But where the sedimentary rock actually forms in crystal form, and can also be a mineral. So there's some overlap there, but this is rock salt. And then we have over here limestone. This is the sort of lithographic limestone, but there's a lot more going on here so if you look at just the gray, that's limestone. Sedimentary rocks also are great places to collect, especially the chemical ones, to collect ore that's important to us. And in this rock, you can see the gray is broken up by all this white. So this limestone was broken up during the process of the formation of the Appalachian Mountains, and during that process, the rock was broken up and cracked and brecciated. All right, so this is all these angular fragments of limestone or breccia, and in the gaps moved groundwater laden with calcium carbonate, leaving behind these white calcite deposits, and also concentrating other minerals like this yellow mineral, which is sphalerite, or zinc sulfide. And in the Timberville, Virginia area, this was mined in the 1950s for zinc. So it was an important source of zinc. This is called a Mississippi Valley type deposit because it's originally defined in the Mississippi Valley. It's similar constituents and so forth in formation. So this is an example of a couple of rocks going on here. I mentioned breccia. That is a term used for clastic sedimentary rocks that are usually have a variety of grain sizes in them, large to small, and the grain sizes are very angular in shape, and they're cemented together. I have another example of that here, and that's this piece of limestone, where you can see all the, let's see, with the best face to see the breccia is probably over here. where you can see all the fragmented pieces that were brecciated again in this limestone from the valley, cemented then together into a rock. All right, so I'm jumping around a little bit here, but this is both a chemical, you could describe it as a chemical sedimentary rock, but you could also describe it as a breccia, but dominantly it's chemical. Okay. All right. Other chemical sedimentary rocks include biochemical rocks like coal. Coal forms through a process called coalification, where you take a swamp where the oxygen levels are low in the water, and you put a bunch of plant material in there, and over time it'll begin to form into peat, and then eventually into lignite, and you're going to add more and more layers, so you're going to increase the temperatures, and you're eventually going to get to bituminous coal, which is what this is, subbituminous to bituminous, and then if you put enough pressure into the system, you can produce anthracite, which is really prized by blacksmiths and some others for industrial purposes because it burns so hot for so long. In fact, there's a place in Pennsylvania, Centralia, Pennsylvania, where the anthracite mine underground is still burning 60 years later. And that's just one example of those kinds of things happening. So another example of a chemical sedimentary rock, I think I've exhausted the ones that I have here. I have one more biochemical to show you, and this is a piece of coquina from Florida. And coquina is just welded together bits or cemented together bits of shell. So that's what this rock is. All right, so that takes us through the biochemical and chemical sedimentary rocks that I have to share with you today. And that takes us to what I think we'll move on to next, which are the clastics. Clastics are give us a whole variety of options here. So starting with the conglomerate, which are the largest grain clastic sedimentary rocks, and this is mostly a sandstone. This is actually Tuscarora sandstone from the Shenandoah Valley. But you can see on top there's a nice chunk of conglomerate here, and these are quartz pebble conglomerates. And so these pebbles came from streams, ancient streams, in this case during the Devonian or Mississippian rather. And during that time, these pebbles were underwater, but they eventually got buried and then lithified into this sandstone. And so, of course, the sandstone isn't consistently conglomerate because there's changes in facies going on here, or there's the overall facies, changes in environment going on from one location to another. But within the larger environment, you have both streams and perhaps a beach environment, right? So, and streams running through a beach. You can envision this if you've been to coastlines and seen streams running across a beach or whatever else. You can go in those areas today and see this kind of deposit being created right now. And that's actually really exciting and an important part of how we interpret sedimentary rocks. You'll also note a couple of other things about this rock. I could look in the rock like this, and oftentimes in this particular one, I'll see what are called sedimentary structures, which might be a particular kind of bedding, where I have flat bedding and I have diagonal bedding. That's called cross bedding. I might see other structures that are ichnofossils or trace fossils in this particular bed. I also look at the color, and it'll tell me something about some of the other mineral composition in here. This rock is very white in color, so it doesn't have a lot of iron in it. But if I were to switch to a sandstone, this one being from northwestern New Mexico, you can see this one has a lot of red in it, and so it's rich in iron. And in many places, iron-rich sandstones have been very important sources of iron ore. Not the richest iron ore. There are places where iron ore is much richer, like up the upper Great Lakes. But we have here a very, very iron-rich sandstone, and this is more of a medium sandstone. You can see that the grains in this white one are generally coarser, more bigger, and these are a little bit smaller. So this is a little bit different environment than, say, this was deposited in. And then we get into, sometimes we get into other things that are more of a gray wacky, which is a funny term. There's more than one actual classification system for sedimentary rocks. And so depending on which direction you go with that, I'm talking about clastics and chemicals and so forth. But there's an additional classification system that adds on to that tries to be more descriptive. Sedimentary rocks are actually quite complicated in many ways because they're not necessarily always consistent. And one of the challenges in any rock identification is that when you're doing field identifications, or even in the lab like this, you're you're making a determination based on what sample you're seeing, but the whole formation may not look that way. The whole formation may consist of a whole wide variety of things, and so to describe 1,000 feet of this formation would be to describe a lot more than just this particular rock. So it gets complicated. All right, but when you have a lot of clay and mud in a rock and sand, then you're gonna form into particular types of sandstone as well. And so this one has a lot of coarse grains in it and a lot of fine grains in it as well. Another one that I think is important to note that's chemical is Arcos. Arcos is a sandstone. In this case, this is from north of Lake Superior. This Arcos is rich in feldspars, especially the potassium feldspars. Those typically break down pretty quickly in weathering, but if they don't break down all that fast and they end up collecting as sand grains, you can form an Arcos. And so this is a medium sandstone, but you can see from the color that is preserved, and so that is makes this a unique specimen here. All right, now if we keep on going down the grain size chart, we end up with mudstones and clay stones, which are pretty much the same, pretty similar, and then shales, right? So we'll get to shale here in a second, and we often get fossils preserved really, really well in these because these fossils were organisms that were perhaps deposited in a lower energy environment, typical of a mud, and then perhaps buried very rapidly, and so you're able to preserve the fossils relatively well. Okay, muds tend to be a little bit deeper water. That's how we usually associate with them, or they can be near the shore. There's certain places where muds do accumulate. In the eastern shore of Virginia and sort of the marshy areas is full of mud, right? So there's lots of different environments where muds can exist. And when you think about muds, we have to think about the other features in the rock, like these fossils, that tell us more about the mud, because mud can be all over the place. But in this case, we have marine fossils that are from deeper water areas. So this is a deeper marine mud. All right, and then we have shales. Sometimes shales will preserve plant fossils. You can see those here, and those are pretty cool. But you can see the bedding here in the shale. All right, this is a really good example here of a shale. This one's been through a little bit of deformation, actually, but it's not a metamorphic rock yet. It's still a shale. Maybe perhaps on its way eventually to becoming once upon a time, maybe becoming a slate, but it didn't make it there. So shale typically breaks apart really nicely in sheets like this, and that's called being fissile, and so this is a good example of that. All right. One of the rock I didn't mention, and it is actually a chemical rock, is travertine, and especially here in the Shenandoah Valley, we have a lot of cave, a lot of karst, and so we get a lot of travertine or flowstone. So this came out of a stream, not a cave. Don't pull anything out of a cave; that's illegal. But I've cut it so I could get a sense of what it looked like on the inside. But this is deposited, left behind by in this case the stream, leaving behind some of its calcium carbonate. So it comes up out of the cave, and it warms up a little bit, or it changes temperature enough a little bit to be able to precipitate the calcium carbonate. Because this is loaded with calcium carbonate. It's all dissolved in the water, but the water can't hold it forever. So over time, it accumulated on the stream bed, and that's what this is from. All right. I could go on and on about sedimentary rocks. They're very exciting rocks, and in fact, I have large collections of them myself because they're my favorite type of rock. But I am biased. I know lots of geoscience friends who much prefer metamorphic rocks or much prefer igneous rocks. So we all have our favorites. But one of my favorite things about sedimentary rocks is growing up, I love dinosaurs. And dinosaurs are preserved in sedimentary rocks. So, this little guy's been following us this whole series, and that's purposeful. All right, that's all I got for sedimentary rocks. Hope you learned something from the video, and look forward to talking to you next time. Well, maybe we'll be out in the field.